Welcome back. Today we shall talk about bureaucracy and taxes. Now one might ask, what do bureaucracy and taxes have to do with each other? A number of things. For one, and the most basic one, is that taxes are collected via bureaucracy, and furthermore, the bureaucrats are paid with the taxes. So if you raise a tax of, let's say, 5% on people's incomes, you need to hire people to keep track of who's paying what and how much. And from those funds you siphon, you need to use them to pay those people who, guess what, they need a wage. As such, whatever you do, you're gonna need one to do the other. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling cycle there. It's why you will never have complete efficiency when it comes to taxes. Because the higher you raise taxes, even if we ignore the matter of growth and the entire studies that have shown that the higher your taxes, the less growth you have, economically, there's also the simple fact that for the higher the taxes you raise, the more people you need to hire to make sure everything's in order. Essentially, the more complicated the tax code, the more you're going to need a large bureaucracy to handle that. However, a bureaucracy isn't inherently bad. For one simple reason. You're going to need one if you're managing a large enough state. Do you think any state could manage 50 provinces, or in our case 50 states, multiple territories, and several hundred military bases across the globe without some form of bureaucracy? No. What about an international organization that runs a continent? That's not gonna happen without a bureaucracy of some kind. So, it's not a matter of getting rid of bureaucracy entirely. That's physically impossible for any administration to do. But rather, it's about maximizing the effectiveness of what bureaucracy there is. So, let's say we're dealing with the United States here. With the United States, it's got a number of things, including the state governments, which have their own bureaucracy, the federal government, and local governments. Now, bureaucracy can be handled in a few ways. The earliest that we have had was hereditary. That was the first people who came over usually were appointed by the king, or were people basically born and descended from the people who previously managed it. That is the most basic form of bureaucracy, is hereditary people who are born into that position. Eventually, however, we came to a new form of government in the United States, and we had a different form of it. Best described as basically crony bureaucracy. This is where the spoil system comes in under Jackson, where essentially he appointed his friends and those he knew into government positions. Several countries have had similar things, though not exactly the same, because each country is different in how they manage their internal affairs. However, this too was also inefficient. And so we find the two more efficient ways of dealing with bureaucracy: appointed and elected bureaucrats. Now one might ask, what's the difference between appointed bureaucrats in this instance? When I say appointed bureaucrats, I effectively mean merit bureaucrats, or those bureaucrats who take a test, fill out a form or whatever, that shows their aptitude, and then the government says, alright, you're hired, you're appointed to this position. So there's test-based bureaucracy and then elected bureaucrats, where, let's say your local ATF director or local person managing whatever affairs is elected by the people of that area rather than being appointed by someone else. So instead of Congress or the presidency appointing people to those roles, they're elected from the people in that location. These two are effective for different reasons, but they share one main benefit that makes them better than the other two. They have the ability to expand. With hereditary bureaucrats, you're entirely relying on family bonds, and although technically a lot of kids can be produced, especially over time with multiple families, so if you have one guy and he has 3 kids, and they can have 3 kids as well, and you get 9 potential people managing an area, it still has an inherent limiting factor if things need to massively expand. Cronyism is the same in this regard, because, well, when you're going by your friends, you can only know so many people. The human mind can only handle like 1,000, 2,000 at most, and I'm being very generous there. And that's just people you know by name. You cannot fill a bureaucracy the size of a whole government in this modern day, especially a very centralized government, with just that. You need more. And so you could maybe go with a friend of a friend, and if someone you appointed says, hey, I know this guy, you could put him in. Let's assume that's just one person, okay? You get an extra 1,000. let's assume each of those 1,000 people still gives you only one. And you subtract one from each because, gotta make it balance. So that's basically 1,000 times 1,000. Yeah, 1,000 times 1,000. It's a million, yes, but you're not really going to be able to achieve that realistically. Likely, you're going to face more like 50,000 or such. You physically cannot get to the limits that you need for a modern bureaucracy, especially because those are in the hundreds of thousands. In fact, let me pause real quick and look up the exact number in the US. I looked it up, and the number is 3 million. Let's take 1 million out because maybe that's the military and those adjacent to them. If we just take the non-military bureaucracy, that's still 2 million people. Good luck on just friends of a friend alone filling that many positions. You could maybe fill some key positions, but at a certain point you're going to need people who aren't just known to you, who are, actually skilled. Especially if you need a rapid expansion. And so that's where the other two come in. With an appointed bureaucracy based on merit and test systems, you can get skilled people relatively quickly, certainly not instant, but relatively quickly, who can fill every point you need in the system. So, for example, you could have leaders of departments, those who communicate between different parts of that said department, and then those individuals who are actually in the department doing the legwork. So the whole system from top to bottom with appointed bureaucrats can be very efficient relative to others. Then there's the matter of elected bureaucrats. They can be useful for a number of reasons, the most important being they're a lot quicker and more accountable. Now, elected officials generally still aren't that accountable relative to others, but they have a very inherent point that makes them more accountable to others, and that's people elect them, and so if something goes really, really wrong, they get deposed, essentially. For example, let's say said ATF director, actually, let's use a different agency, let's say the TSA. Let's say a local TSA deals with a terrorist incident and leads to many deaths in your local area. How likely are you, honestly, to vote that guy back in when it comes time to assess his performance? Not very likely. And so that guy gets deposed, replaced by a new guy, and that dude has a constant reminder that if he messes up like that again, the people are going to be breathing down his neck and seeking vengeance. So he pressures the people down the ground to do a lot harder, and so they achieve their job more efficiently. Now, with that being said, there's still some inefficiency there just because it's an elected official. Same with appointed bureaucrats due to their very hard nature of getting rid of. But the fact is, both of these systems have a lot of flexibility for expansion and compression if necessary. For example, if, let's say, the US government cut 1 million of those jobs because they got rid of a lot of the programs, well, guess what? The appointed bureaucracy makes it a lot easier because you're not dealing with friends of friends and people who are politically connected for the most part, especially down the lower rungs. You're just dealing with people who are working basically a 9 to 5, or a similar concept to that, and so you can just fire them like any other employer. People may not like that, but it's true, and it works efficiently. Furthermore, it provides a lot of flexibility for expansion as well. Let's say there's a war going on. And ignoring the military aspect, which is pretty obvious when there's a lot of people going into the military, it increases the size. But for the bureaucracy that's still in the home turf, there's a lot more work for them too. Because think about it. When there's a war going on, basically every resource, or at least quite a few of them, have to be diverted to the war effort. So you need to hire people who aren't managing the war itself, so officers, NCOs, and troops on the ground. I've forgot them for some reason. But you don't just need them. You also need people in the capital making sure that logistics are going that way. Making sure that, oh yeah, we ordered this and that it's actually going there, and keeping track of the numbers and all that. You essentially have to have those people who are working with the military to make sure everything goes out to the troops when they need them. Simultaneously, you also need them to act as a go-between between the government and the military. And so having appointed bureaucrats or elected bureaucrats makes that a whole lot quicker to do because, well, it's just a matter of finding enough people to fill the positions, and you're relying on a whole country of 300 million. Pretty sure it's easy to get another million out of that. And so it naturally makes managing the country easier. Now here's the thing in how it relates to taxation. When it comes to taxes, there is a tax rate that the government sets and the efficiency at which they set it. Now, there's a number of factors that go into this, but one of them is the bureaucracy. Let's say hypothetically that we're in a perfect world, and just for tax efficiency, your government runs perfectly well. There's no tax evasion, nothing. You're likely going to see efficiency go up, then it'll hit about 50% and then go down. This is because growth slows down as taxes go up, meaning you're making less money over time, and eventually you actually start losing revenue as you increase your taxes. Now let's say hypothetically we're dealing with a modern first world bureaucracy like the United States. Corruption is relatively low, but there's still tax evasion and there's still corrupt people. What'll happen instead is you'll likely get the rise of taxes similar, but it'll stop a bit earlier, let's say like 45%, and then it'll decline. Now that's not good. It means you can't raise taxes as high. Alright, what about a third world economy? Let's say third world country, lots of corruption, maybe just finished a civil war, like a lot of them have, and so they're looking to raise taxes. Well, that's not looking good for you because it's likely going to get about to here before it starts declining, because if there's a lot of people who already don't want to listen to you, do you think that they're going to listen to you suddenly because you said, hey, maybe we should try this new tax rate we need to balance the budget? No, they ain't going to care. Forgive my bad drawings, but that should at least illustrate the point of tax efficiency goes down as you increase the rate at a certain point, and that is tied to bureaucracy and how well it works. So, whereas the United States can get away with higher taxes because it's got a very efficient bureaucracy, relative efficient bureaucracy, and it has lower corruption than quite a few countries, if you're going to, say, Kenya, you're not going to get nearly as efficient the tax collection, and so your tax rate has to be lower in order to accommodate that, especially because tax evasion is a big threat here. At this level, it's a lot harder to get by because people aren't just going to pay the taxes. They're going to be people actively avoiding paying your taxes, especially those who you just beat in order to maintain, a stable country. And so, as things go by and corruption is reduced, you can raise taxes, but furthermore, as things get more advanced and your bureaucracy becomes more effective, you can still raise taxes, but you're still going to start falling off at a certain point. Which is why it's more efficient to, say, have it at 35% rather than 60%. And as a matter of fact, the 90% taxes people talk about when they're referring to the U.S. during the New Deal mostly weren't paid because people just found ways to avoid it. As a matter of fact, the government itself built in ways to avoid paying that tax. So basically no one, and by basically no one I mean at most one person, were paying less than that 90%. Because there were so many different loopholes to get out of it that you could not have any reasonable person paying that 90%. People were getting tax breaks for going on yachts. That was how bad it was. Legitimately, there are less loopholes in the modern tax code than in that one. But the reason this is important is because that bureaucracy, those 3 million people I was talking about earlier, that's paid by this. That's how they raise money. Taxes. Could be on property, could be on income, could be on tobacco. Doesn't matter, it's still taxes. And so how they handle it has got to be efficient. And that's where things like Doge comes in. What's more efficient, would you say? 500,000 people working with paper in an older fashion, maybe calling people, making sure everything's alright, filling out forms and making sure everything checks out. Or one dude on a computer making sure that things are running quickly and efficiently. Now, if you scale that up to 100,000, as would be reasonable for a bureaucracy, then that would be a whole lot more efficient than the 500,000. For one, because you can just pull up the paper by going to a secure website and typing in the name, and boom, the file comes up. You can check it there. It saves a lot of time and makes things a whole lot more efficient. And that's part of what Doge was trying to do. It wasn't just tax cuts and getting rid of wasteful spending. It was also updating the bureaucracy with technology and other things to make it more efficient at its job. Because again, if you have 100,000 dudes with computers and technology doing the work of 500,000, that saves a lot of money, saves a lot of resources of paper, pens, and ink, and it also just generally makes things more efficient. Which is good when you're trying to say, hey, we're doing a good job managing all this territory. You kind of need to look like you're actually doing it. Now, that being said, there are also different ways to organize your bureaucracy. The U.S. is a federal state, but we're still fairly centralized. Now, we didn't always used to be this centralized. For a lot of our history, we were very decentralized in terms of how we handle things. For example, did you know our military wasn't centralized under the federal government for literal years? Legitimately, it wasn't until like the Civil War or possibly slightly earlier that we really got the military centralized under the federal government, because it was mostly militias at the start. Sure, there was a standing army, but it wasn't that big relative to most others. And so the U.S. government relied on militias, where it would say, hey, Virginia, call up your militia and send it to us. We need the soldiers. Hey, Massachusetts, call up your militias. We need the soldiers. And so even just the military was decentralized. We didn't have a united force. Now we have a professional army along with possible mass conscription with selective service if necessary. But at the time, when we were first founded, that wasn't the case. Even our military was decentralized. Things like Medicare and Medicaid, which, although they split the burden between the states and the federal government, still are very much centralizing in their nature as federal programs. Sure, California might do some things. Excuse me. Sure, California might do some things different from Texas, and some might just say, no, we're not going to take your money for this. But even still, it's very heavily centralizing the government because it's a mandate. If the federal government says, if we give you money, you do this, a lot of those grants states are going to take because they need the freaking money. So you're going to just have that happen, and it inherently puts more power in the federal government through the power of the purse. After all, he who controls the money controls the decision making. Since guess what? Money is the best way to demonstrate scarcity, because it means people can only afford so much. Now, the U.S. is fairly middling when it comes to this. We're part centralized with programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the like, who are top-down from the federal government and don't have many ways out of them. As a matter of fact, while some places are separate from Social Security, it's not an option. So, for example, Chicago, I believe it's like teachers in Chicago. I know Alaskan teachers are separate as well. But, like, there are these small pockets of people who aren't under Social Security. They aren't. But that doesn't mean they chose to leave. That was something built in when Social Security was passed into law. So they're not part of it. They can't choose to get on it. They're not part of it at all. But at the same time, if you're on Social Security, you don't have a choice in paying it. You don't have a choice in receiving it. You just get it. And so it's one of those you don't have a choice situations where it heavily puts power in the federal government. But we're not the most centralized there. That title, I'd argue, goes to France. The Kings of Centralization. Because it might as well just be called Paris with how much influence any other territory has. Where's all the bureaucracy? Paris. Who makes the decisions? Paris. Where do all the people meet up to decide things? Paris. It's basically just Paris with a few places, like vineyards outside of it. It's like, it is basically Paris. The Ile-de-France controls the entire country. And it is very, very centralized as a state. French Constitution, be all end all. There isn't much that, say, Normandy can do, Brittany, Aquitaine, Provence. No, it's all under Paris. On the other hand, there's Germany. who has a bureaucracy like a Byzantine hexscape, but it's very decentralized into the provinces. Bavaria, Saxony, stuff like that. It's not really that big in terms of federal bureaucracy. In fact, the main state, the Bundesrepublik, you might say, does not have the full ability to make its own laws. As a matter of fact, when they were trying to implement green policies, the states themselves stopped them from doing so, effectively, by putting them in court battles for years upon years until it was just not worth it, so they almost gave up. That's how powerful the provinces are in Germany. What would be called states in the US are provinces in Canada. That's how powerful they are in Germany. And they got a bureaucratic apparatus like no one's business. And so that's really the thing when it comes to bureaucracy. There are a few ways to do it, but there's the decentralized model like Germany has, the centralized model like France, or the in-between way of the United States. And while all of them have their benefits, the main thing is it's got to be efficient. For example, in Germany, there are people who get bogged down in paperwork because the guy sitting at the desk says, all right, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do 83 steps just to get it even slightly through. While in France, similar thing, just with some guy from Paris. Simultaneously, in the US, we have similar things. It can be both from the states or from the federal government. Now, because we have some decentralization, this is somewhat mitigated based on where you live. For example, in California, there are people still complaining, like 5 years later, about not being able to install solar panels because of all the things you need to do to get through. However, in South Carolina, I have someone who moved down there, and they were able to establish their solar panels within like the first year of them moving down there. That being said, it varies. So you have places like California, which are a bureaucratic nightmare, and then places like Texas, which are a lot easier. Actually, the South as a whole is a lot easier to do things. Though it also depends on your locality. For example, cities have their own laws, and so, generally speaking, depending on where you live, that can impact. It all depends, really. But as a general rule, what matters for bureaucracy most is efficiency. And that's the reason why it's often better to be smaller. It's like a professional army. It's a lot better to have 100,000 crack troops who are professionals and know what they're doing than 1 million conscripts. Because the moment those conscripts hit the actual battlefield, they're going to break and rout because they don't want to be there and they're not good at their jobs. In the same way, it's better to have a small bureaucracy focused on the few important things and let everything else be sorted out by others. For example, do we need Medicare and Medicaid? Not really. There could be private insurances who do the exact same thing. There could be charities that do the exact same thing. A number of ways we could achieve the exact same result without the mind-numbing bureaucracy of it all. That basically functions as a subsidy for the healthcare industry. Simultaneously, do we need Social Security? I'd argue not really, again, because it's less effective than a Roth IRA and doesn't really contribute to things. And so, it's often better just let that be handled by the private sector. What you want is for the bureaucrats you do have to be good at their jobs. They're not there to be people's friends. They're not there to push pencils. They're there to do their jobs. Manage the paperwork that needs to get done. The bureaucracy will always touch every part of our lives because it is needed to manage the basics of the state. From taxes, to making sure everything is working with the laws, to making sure the courts get word of the new laws and everything's enforced. All that needs to be done. Someone has to say, alright, we got the new law, we gotta make sure it's copied down into where it needs to be, sent to who needs to have it, all that. Furthermore, they also need to make sure, alright, we got the taxes, we know how much this guy's paid, how much this guy's paid, how much was owed. Alright, they made a bit extra, so we're gonna send that back as a tax return later. All that needs to be handled. And so you need an efficient bureaucracy for that. You can't have no bureaucracy. However, and this is the important thing, it's got to be efficient. Because if you have 800,000 bureaucrats working for you, it does not matter how many you keep hiring. If they're not getting their job done, they're basically wasted money. So you got to make sure it's efficient. For your taxes, you're going to need an efficient bureaucracy. For the law, efficient bureaucracy. for basic management of the state's apparatus. You're gonna need bureaucracy, but it's gotta be efficient. Anything else is secondary.